This is your content lecture on the Italian late medieval period. This is a period of a lot of continuity and change. You'll see that there's a lot of elements from the Byzantine and Gothic era that remain. However, you get this infusion of naturalism that comes with humanism. Humanism is a scholastic and behavioral theory in which you have scholars really interested in ancient Rome and antiquity. They're also really interested in the idea of human activity as being the most significant contributor to the world. And along these lines, you get this cult of individuality in which all of a sudden artists' names matter. They're signing their works because there's this interest in what individual people can accomplish. We'll be focusing on Florence and Siena, and the artists associated with those places are Giotto and Duccio. And so individuality certainly matters in individual styles. However, something to keep in mind about all these artists is that they're working for clients. So they're never just making this art because they feel like it. Rather, they're being paid by patrons to make an altar for a specific church or a specific space. And so they're always trying to negotiate both their personal style and the demands of the project. So here's our map. We're starting in Florence here. And in terms of the geography of this region, it's on the same latitude as New York City. So they have cold winters, warm summers, and pretty similar to what we're used to in the Northeast. Okay, the first thing we're looking at is not by Giotto, but rather by Cimabue, and it actually dates from a little bit earlier than the start of this period, so it's from around 1280. But I want to talk about it a little bit just because this is such a good example of where we're coming from. So looking at this monumental altarpiece, I mean, it's big, 12 feet 7 inches tall and 7 feet across. Notice the way this is really so similar to some of the stuff we talked about in the Byzantine period. So in our comparison, you can see we've got Madonna enthroned at center. She's surrounded by angels and saints. So the subject matter totally the same. The background of the Cimabue is gold in a way that should really remind us of Byzantine art. However, the differences are in the medium. This is tempera, and I had the definition for that on the last slide. But also look at how much more three-dimensional this is. You can see that they're reintroducing linear perspective in the throne. It looks like there's this space between her legs where the drapery hangs. Her foot is foreshortened, coming out into our space. It's just much more interested in the creation of believable bodies in space. So none of this floaty, weird paper dolls that you have in the subject matter from the Byzantine period. Rather, Cimabue is really interested in creating believable bodies. Cimabue is important because he's Giotto's teacher. Giotto is often called the father of Western pictorial art, and you'll see why. So here is Giotto doing the same exact subject matter. This is a Madonna enthroned, surrounded by saints and angels. But here you have an even more dramatic introduction of naturalism. So part of this, look at her leg. The way that this actually looks like there's fabric hanging on it, and the way that he modulates these colors so carefully in order to create that effect. Look at how these angels down here seem to be actually standing on the ground around them, as opposed, and back here you can see they also seem to be standing on this ground. Now, she's hierarchically scaled, certainly, right? She's giant. And she's set into this little throne that kind of looks like a Gothic church, but she is very much more naturalistic than what we're used to. You especially see this in the comparison with the Cimabue, right? The angels on the side of Cimabue's throne, they look like they're stacked up on top of each other, completely flat, whereas these saints all seem believably organized around her. We marveled at the three-dimensionality of this drapery here. It is nothing compared to what Giotto is doing with his colors here. And so you can really see that there's this push towards ever greater naturalism. And why are they interested in that? It's because they're looking at ancient artwork. They're really interested in ancient Rome, ancient sculptures, and all of those styles that we talked about back in Unit 2. Okay, so we're going to leave Florence and go to Padua, which is in northern Italy, because this is really Giotto's masterpiece. So he was also an architect. I mean, the idea of a Renaissance man starts with Giotto. He's an architect, he's a painter, he could probably sculpt, he can do everything. So he designed this tiny church. It's called the Arena Chapel because it's next to a Roman arena. The patron for this is Enrico Scrovegni. Here he is. You'll see him inside the church too. And look, he's holding a model of the church that he's giving to these angels. So he paid for this because his family was in trouble because they charged interest on their loans that they gave out from their bank, and you're not supposed to do that. So, in order to get back in the good graces of the Pope, he said, I will pay for this chapel, and people can visit it and give donations, and everybody will be okay. And the Pope's like, yep, fine with that. Here is the interior of the church, and you can see that it is floor-to-ceiling frescoes. Now, this should make you think of all of the painted traditions that we talked about in Italy in Unit 2. So think of the Etruscans, think of the Roman villas, and in Pompeii, all of those painted interiors. It's coming back, right? They're interested in doing that again. And they have the same types of trompe-l'oeil that we talked about in ancient Rome. So remember in Pompeii, where they have those marble bases, the dados, where it looked like marble but it was actually paint. That's what we've got here too. And then floor to ceiling paintings, the ceiling painted as if it has stars in the sky. That is very much like what we saw in the Etruscan tombs. Over here on the back wall, so this is the entrance, and if you look up here, you can see there's our little Enrico Scrovegni. You've got Christ in the center. This is the Last Judgment. These are the people going to heaven. These are the people going to hell in a river of blood. Lovely. And I include this just so you get a sense of the scale. It's a relatively small space, but I've never been here, but I think it must be really impressive to go in and just see all of it. So it's fresco. We talked about this back in the Minoan culture, but here's the process. So you've got 4 different layers, and the most important layer, of course, is when you apply the pigment to the wet plaster, and then the plaster and the pigment fuse to the wall, making the painting literally part of the wall. It means you need to work quickly, but also carefully, because there's no going back after you've made a mistake, unless you're going to go all the way back down to the scratch coat and the sand coat again. All right, so I want to look closely at just one of these. Art historians flip out over these paintings because they are so rich in terms of their style and iconography and the way that the artists blend those things together. These are phenomenal works of art just because every line, every shape, every gesture has both stylistic and theological significance. So just to think about it a little bit, we're looking at this one area of the interior. This is the lamentation. The subject matter here, Jesus is already dead and they're about to put him into the tomb, but before they do that, they're all going to grieve. We've got all sorts of different individualized people here, right? They look different from each other. Here's Mary. She is grieving that like ugly cry grieving. Over here is John, and he is wailing with grief. Mary Magdalene with her long hair holding his feet in the same way she washed his feet with her hair while he was alive. They all look completely distressed. But over here, the men, not so sad, right? They're just kind of, it is what it is. He's dead now. But what's noteworthy is you have these different expressions of grief. This demonstrates individuality, something that they're really interested at the time. This space is also really interesting for the way that it uses composition. So it's interesting if you think about this, why do we know to look at Jesus in this full space? Well, he's the only one lying horizontally. Everyone else is more vertically oriented around him. You also have this landscape background, this rock pointing right to his face. Isn't that lovely? And that works out too because it's the tomb where he's going to get buried, and it creates this really dynamic asymmetrical composition that is still very legible. It also incorporates a major theological concept. So up here you've got this dead tree. This dead tree is supposed to be the tree of knowledge from which Adam and Eve took the apple. And the reason that Jesus has to die within Christian theology is because of the original sin of Adam and Eve. And so you've got the tree of knowledge of good and evil leading right to Christ. So Stylistically, this works because it balances the composition. It points to Christ, but it also points to this theological message. If we get in a little closer, another thing I just love about this is the way that you've got these two random people with their backs to you, right? Why include random people's backs? Well, I mean, partially it creates like a parentheses around his face, but it invites you to come in and mourn alongside them. It's incredibly emotional, right? It's basically inviting you to go in, touch Christ's body, and be part of this grief. Anyway, this is what I think makes art historians just like love this stuff, and you can tell I kind of love it too. Let's spend some time looking closely at the painting style. So look at the way that he incorporates these details. Again, it's all about color, right? So this is a technique called chiaroscuro. It's a lovely Italian word that literally means light dark, and it's the way that artists use contrasts of light and dark to suggest depth or to model their figures. So here, why does this person look lumpy? Because you have this light part here right next to the dark part, and the light part seems to come closer to us. You can also see that he's playing with perspective. I love these angels. Aren't they funny? Look at this diving angel, or he's like swooping up. So sad, this one too. All of these techniques are ways that Giotto is experimenting with creating space. All right, so enough of Giotto. Now we're going to talk about Siena. The Sienese down here are the arch nemesis of the Florentines. You can see their republics are kind of intertwined and they're constantly at war with each other. The Sienese have a very strong navy, and that brings them a lot of money, and it's a very wealthy center. We are interested in the work of Duccio. Duccio is the parallel to Giotto, if you will. They're working at the same time. They have a somewhat different style, though, as we will see. So what we're looking at here is called the Maestà. The Maestà means virgin and child enthroned and surrounded by saints and angels, but nobody calls it that. It just is known as the Maestà. And it's in the major church of Siena, the Siena Cathedral, and it's massive. To give you a sense of that, look how big it is right here. And do you know what? This is not even the whole thing. It was bigger than this originally. So here it is in a digital reconstruction of what it originally looked like. You can see it had this massive frame and all sorts of smaller panels included within it that present a narrative. Here's the backside. More narrative. All of these are the life of Christ and the Passion. Okay, so let's talk about what's going on here. This is very similar to those Madonnas enthroned that we talked about in the beginning by Cimabue and Giotto, but now Duccio's just takes it to the whole new level. So we've got giant hierarchically scaled Madonna sitting on her throne right here, and notice how that becomes basically the line of symmetry. It's quite obsessively symmetrical on either side of that, with each angel and saint corresponding with what's going over here. That symmetry, also this gold background, all of that should remind you of Byzantine art. It's very similar. What should remind you of the new naturalism of this Italian late medieval period is the use of chiaroscuro. So you can always see it in her robes and the way he modulates the blues to suggest her knee right here, but you can also see it up in her face. You can see that the baby Jesus has it in his drapery. It becomes really a governing principle. Now, in terms of individuality, you see that here too. Look, we've got John the Baptist in his hairy clothes. You have other individualized saints, a pope, all of that in here. But then you also have these angels who all pretty much look alike surrounding him. Another thing to think about here is the use of space. It's far less naturalistic than what we saw Giotto doing. In that way, it's closer to the Cimabue because you have all these saints stacked on top of each other. The other thing that's really interesting about this work is it's one of the few works where we actually have the contract for which it was that commissioned Duccio to do it, and it was the city who paid Duccio to make this altarpiece. And they basically said he wasn't allowed to work on anything else until he finished this. So they wanted him to get it done quickly. And then we have an account of what happened when he did finish it. There was basically a parade from Duccio's house to the cathedral where they installed the altarpiece, which is just fabulous to think about, right? That this artwork was such an important thing for Siena that it became an event, its installation. And part of that is that the Virgin Mary, she's not just the mother of God for these Sienese people, but she's kind of their mascot for the city. Siena is called the ancient city of the Virgin. So for them, it's really a big deal. Also, what's fabulous about this, he signs it on her altar as if you would ever forget. So it's like right there as you're looking at it. And remember the scale. So basically, if you're standing here and you're looking at it, you are looking at his signature. And in the signature, he asks that God would bless him for doing such a good job at making the Virgin Mary. Yeah. Okay, so one more thing from this. I want to talk just briefly about what's going on back here in this small panel. So all of these were deconstructed in the 17th century. I'm not sure why they did that. And they were pretty much spread all over the world. Some of them are still in Siena. Some of them are actually in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. One of these angels up here is at the PMA. So should you find yourself at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, check out our little piece of the Maestà. Okay, so zooming in here, I want to do this because you can see that some of the strategies here are really similar to Giotto in the way that he's using the space to tell the story. So Jesus really stands out here because he's in the middle, but also because you've got this tree pointing right towards him. All of the people around him are fleeing. So what's happening here? This is Judas kissing Jesus and leading all of the elders and the Roman soldiers to arrest him. Here's Peter, Jesus' right-hand man, chopping off this guy's ear. Jesus says, no, no, please don't do that. And he puts the ear back on. And then over here are his disciples running away. It's crazy, but you can still pretty much figure out what's going on because of these trees. So you've got the one pointing to Jesus, you've got the others kind of distinguishing this group from the fleeing disciples over here. And what I really love is when you look at it in relationship to the whole altarpiece, because most people weren't going to get as close as we just were, right? They're only going to see it from afar. So how are they supposed to understand what's going on? Well, look at how this panel relates to the one above it. That cross with Jesus on it, which is pretty legible, goes right down to here. The space where he is repeated right below. This is Christ's agony. This is him praying in the garden. And you can see it's the same space and he's wearing the same thing, so it makes it much easier to recognize Jesus. All right, last thing, I promise. We have to talk about the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena. This is the city hall. This is a room where 9 ruling families governed Siena. Siena was a republic, but it was kind of an oligarchy because it's really governed by aristocrats, but not a king, if you will. And this is a space where they are supposed to mete out peace and justice for the Sienese people. In order to encourage that, they hire students of Duccio, Ambrogio Lorenzetti, to make this fresco showing the effects of good and bad government. So here we have a fresco with good government. This is good government in the city. We'll look closely at that. And good government in the countryside. We'll also look closely at that. Behind us, I haven't been in this room, but it's in really bad shape, and so apparently you can't even look at bad government. Okay, so what we're looking at here is a representation of Siena. And what's fascinating about this is it's somewhat accurate in some ways. Like over here, this is the bell tower and the dome of Siena Cathedral, so it would have been recognizable. These buildings might represent different buildings within the city. Is it naturalistic? Not exactly. It sort of has an M.C. Escher effect with all of these attempts at linear perspective, but he's attempting it, and that's what matters. Also, look at all of these people. They're kind of too big for the space, right? Like these are giant people in comparison to the buildings. They would not fit on the second stories of these buildings. But that's okay because them being bigger means we can see them better, and they're all doing really interesting things. So these are a visiting group of dancers performing in the street. You've got people playing games. You've got wealthy people entering the city. You have merchants, all of this produce and livestock coming in. You've got construction. All of this stuff suggests a really prosperous city. Then in the countryside, you can see that there's all sorts of harvest activity going on every part of the harvest. So both the planting of the seeds, the growing of it, and the harvesting of it. So that's not exactly naturalistic, but it suggests that it's a flourishing area. You've got people coming into the city right here. And then all these little houses. This is a big deal because it's the first landscape since antiquity. It's also one of the first works of secular art that we've studied in a really long time, and this just sets the stage for the Renaissance that's going to come. Anyway, so that's the end of our content lecture. Thanks so much.